At what should have been a joyful Christmas dinner, my twin sons arrived with lawyers instead of gifts. They spread documents across the table, each demanding I choose who deserved more of my estate. I stayed silent, letting them battle, because I already had a secret decision waiting to shock them both. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss future stories like this one. My name is Howard, and for most of my life I believed I had raised two sons who would always stand side by side. Their names are Peter and Charles. They were born only minutes apart. Twins who shared the same crib, the same toys, and the same birthday cakes covered with crooked candles I lit each year. When they were little, people used to laugh at how inseparable they were, finishing each other's sentences and running to defend one another from playground trouble. I would often stand by their bedroom door at night, listening to their whispered conversations, proud that no matter what, they had each other. But as the years passed, that closeness began to shift into rivalry, and the bond I thought was unbreakable slowly turned into something bitter. It started not long after their mother Margaret passed away. Without her steady voice between us, Peter wanted to take charge of everything in the house, while Charles argued over the smallest decisions, determined to prove he was just as responsible. At first, I thought it was harmless competition, but then I began hearing sharper remarks. Peter would remind me how often he came by to help, while Charles would bring up the money he had loaned me during a difficult time. What seemed like small jabs at first soon grew into open attempts to show me who cared more. Every visit turned into a quiet battle for my approval, and though no one said it outright yet, I could feel what it was really about: my will and the inheritance they believed I owed them. By the time Christmas drew near, I could feel the tension like a rope pulled too tight. I hoped for peace, just one holiday where the table would be filled with laughter as it had been when Margaret was alive. But instead, I could sense the storm waiting, and deep inside I knew this Christmas dinner would not be like the others. That Christmas morning I woke up earlier than usual, the house quiet except for the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I had decorated the tree a week before, stringing the same worn ornaments Margaret had collected over the years, each one carrying a memory. I laid out the good china she had loved, the ones we only used on special occasions. I wanted everything to feel warm, familiar, and welcoming, hoping maybe the spirit of the season would soften the edges of my son's rivalry. But the truth was, I was nervous. My hands shook as I placed the silverware because I knew Peter and Charles had not spoken kindly to each other in months. Each phone call I had with them ended with complaints about the other. It felt less like they were trying to be good sons, and more like they were building cases against one another, stacking up reasons why they should be seen as my favorite. By noon the table was set, the turkey was roasting in the oven, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifted through the house. It should have been comforting, but instead, I felt a knot in my stomach. When I heard tires crunching against the driveway, my heart sank. First it was Peter, stepping out in his dark coat, carrying not gifts or food, but a stiff leather briefcase. He barely looked around the house as he entered, his eyes sharp and restless. A few minutes later, Charles arrived in much the same way, his shoulders squared, holding a folder thick with papers. My chest grew heavy as I realized this wasn't going to be the family Christmas I had longed for. They hadn't come to celebrate with me. They had come to fight. Peter walked straight into the dining room, his shoes clicking against the hardwood floor I had polished the night before. He set his briefcase on the chair beside him as if he were preparing for a meeting rather than a holiday meal. Charles followed a moment later, his folder tucked tightly under his arm, his jaw clenched. They didn't greet each other, not even a forced handshake. Instead, their eyes met with the kind of stare that carried years of resentment. I stood there at the head of the table, trying to force a smile, but I already felt like a stranger in my own home. "Father," Peter said flatly, pulling out a stack of papers, I think it's time we had an honest discussion. We can't keep avoiding this." His voice was calm, but I could hear the sharp edge behind it. Charles sat down heavily, dropping his folder on the table with a loud thud. "I agree," he said, his tone colder than I'd ever heard. "This has dragged on too long, and it's only fair that everything gets settled now." The sight of them, each armed with documents, broke something in me. This was Christmas Day, the one day I had prayed we could set aside differences and remember what family meant. Yet here they were, acting like opponents in a courtroom, ready to argue their worth. The food I had worked so hard to prepare sat untouched, steam rising from the dishes, while the air between my sons grew heavier by the second. I realized then that nothing about this evening was going to resemble the Christmases we once knew. I lowered myself into my chair, trying to steady my breathing, as both of them spread their papers across the table like battle maps. The turkey sat in the center, golden and steaming, but it may as well have been invisible. Peter slid a sheet toward me, tapping it with his finger. "Here is proof of every time I came to help you around the house, from repairing the roof to..." "Short. I kept records, Father. Records that show who has been responsible." His words cut through the room like a blade. Charles gave a sharp laugh, bitter and hollow. "Responsible? You mean the one who always wanted credit for every small thing? I didn't write down what I did because I wasn't trying to earn points. When the furnace broke 2 winters ago, who stayed up all night fixing it with you? When you needed money for Mom's medical bills, who handed you his savings without hesitation? I didn't make lists, Father, because I wasn't competing." His voice cracked as he said it, but the anger in his eyes was stronger than the pain. I sat there, staring at the 2 men Margaret and I had raised with love and sacrifice. They were supposed to be brothers, not enemies. Yet each word they spoke was meant to pull me one way or the other, as if I were a prize to be won. My stomach twisted with shame, not only for their behavior but also for my silence over the years that allowed this bitterness to grow. The clock in the hallway ticked louder than their voices, reminding me of how quickly time was slipping away while my family tore itself apart. The lawyers were the next to speak, each one as cold and formal as the documents they carried. Peter's lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading from a prepared statement about contributions and entitlements, his voice dry and practiced, as though he were presenting a case in court. Charles's lawyer interrupted with his own arguments, waving receipts and letters across the table. The sound of their words mixed with the clinking of silverware as they shifted papers, and the smell of roasted turkey seemed almost mocking. This was supposed to be Christmas, yet it felt like a trial staged in my dining room. I watched Peter lean back in his chair, his expression smug, while Charles grew red-faced, gripping his folder so tightly the edges bent. "Father," Charles finally said, his voice rising above the lawyer's, "I deserve fairness. I've sacrificed more than he has, and everyone knows it. Don't let him twist things with fancy paperwork." Peter shot back immediately. "Sacrifice? You spent years chasing your own life while I was here. If anyone deserves more, it's me." Their words hit me harder than I expected. Every memory of them as little boys flashed before me, running through the yard with toy swords, racing each other on bicycles, laughing so hard they fell into the grass. Now they were grown men reduced to shouting, begging me to choose between them. I felt the weight of decades of love, the sleepless nights, the hard work, the sacrifices Margaret and I had made for them, being pushed aside like they were meaningless. All that mattered to them now was what they could take from me once I was gone. I tried to steady my hands as I reached for my glass of water, though even that small movement caught their attention. Both of them fell silent for a moment, their eyes fixed on me as if my next words would decide everything. I could feel the heat of the fireplace behind me, yet a coldness settled in my chest. For years I had avoided these conversations, hoping time would soften their rivalry. But now here it was, laid bare in front of me, louder than the Christmas bells outside. Charles leaned forward, his face tight with frustration. "You can't ignore this anymore, Father. We need to know where we stand. It isn't fair to keep us waiting." His lawyer nodded firmly, sliding another sheet toward me as if that would settle the matter. Peter shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable," before snapping open his briefcase again. "Father, I have outlined exactly how much I've invested in this house and your care over the years. Charles can pretend all he wants, but numbers don't lie." He pushed the papers across the table with sharp movements, his jaw clenched. The weight of their demands pressed on me until it felt hard to breathe. I stared at the food growing cold, the candles flickering weakly, and I thought about Margaret's last Christmas. She had asked me to promise one thing, that I would do whatever it took to keep the family together. I had promised her, holding her hand, believing I could keep it. But as I looked at my sons now, tearing each other apart in the house she once filled with warmth, I realized that promise was already broken. And maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the only chance I had left to make things right. The shouting started again before I could say a word. Peter jabbed his finger across the table, his voice sharp enough to rattle the plates. "He's only here when it benefits him. He never cared until he realized there was money involved." Charles slammed his palm down so hard the glasses shook. "That's a lie. You've been whispering in Father's ear for years, trying to poison him against me." Their lawyers tried to quiet them, but the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. I sat frozen in my chair, my chest aching with every insult they hurled. These were the same boys I had once tucked into bed, telling them stories to help them dream. I remembered Christmas mornings when their eyes lit up brighter than the tree lights, when their laughter filled the house. But now, the sound of their voices was sharp, bitter, and ugly. "Enough," I whispered at first, but they didn't hear me. "Enough," I said louder, rising to my feet. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. Both of them stared at me, waiting, expecting me to finally choose between them. My hands gripped the back of my chair as I steadied myself. Inside me, something shifted. For years I had stayed quiet, hoping time would heal their selfishness. Tonight, I realized silence was no longer an option. Something had to be said, and it would change everything. I stood there at the head of the table, staring at the two men, who were once my boys, my pride, and my comfort after Margaret died. Now they sat like strangers, armed with lawyers and paperwork, waiting for me to speak, as if I were nothing more than a judge in their case. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. The flickering candles cast long shadows across their faces, and for the first time I could clearly see how greed had carved away at everything good in them. "Do you think this is what your mother wanted?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Neither of them answered. Peter's jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. Charles looked down at his hands, gripping the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. I pressed on, my voice growing louder. "She gave her life making sure you both had everything you needed. We sacrificed so much. Do you remember when she worked double shifts at the hospital so you could have new coats one winter? Do you remember me building your bicycles in the garage late at night because we couldn't afford store-bought ones? And now, after everything, the two of you sit here fighting like vultures over what will be left when I'm gone." Peter opened his mouth, but I lifted my hand and stopped him. "No, you will not interrupt me this time. I have listened to your arguments for years, each of you trying to turn me against the other. Do you know what that has done to me? Do you know what it feels like to see your children, the ones you carried home in your arms, reduced to nothing but rivals?" My voice broke on the last word, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the fireplace. I leaned heavily on the back of my chair, the memories of Margaret weighing on me like stones. She had always been the peacemaker, always reminding me that family mattered more than money, more than anything. And now here they were, proving her greatest fear true, that once she was gone, the family would tear itself apart. Peter shifted uneasily in his chair. Father, it's not about greed, it's about fairness. Charles snapped his head up. Fairness? You wouldn't know fairness if it stared you in the face. I raised my voice sharp enough to cut through both of them. Enough. This ends tonight. You will hear my decision, and you will not argue, because I have carried this weight long enough. The room went still. Even the lawyer sat back, silent, sensing that whatever I was about to say would end the fight one way or another. My heart pounded as I looked at my sons, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange calm. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it was something neither of them expected. I walked slowly around the table, each step echoing in the silence. Peter and Charles both turned to follow me with their eyes, but neither dared to speak. I could see the hunger in them, the way they leaned forward slightly, waiting for me to finally tip the scale in one of their favors. They were. Like gamblers sitting on the edge of their seats, ready to grab their winnings. The thought made my stomach twist. I stopped at the far end of the table, my hand brushing across the back of Margaret's chair. She had sat there for every Christmas dinner, smiling, carving the turkey, scolding us gently if the boys bickered. Her absence filled the room like a shadow, and I wished more than anything she could have been here to see what her sons had become. I turned back to them. You've both spent years trying to convince me you deserve more, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet. You've whispered, you've argued, and now you've brought strangers into my home to speak for you. Strangers, on Christmas Day. Do you even hear yourselves? Peter glanced at his lawyer, as though searching for support, but the man stayed quiet. Charles shifted in his seat, his face red with shame or anger. I couldn't tell which. I leaned on the table, my hands flat against the wood I had polished with Margaret for decades. Do you know what I wanted tonight? I wanted peace. I wanted to see my sons laughing, telling old stories, remembering the times when we didn't have much but we had each other. I wanted to hear the sound of family, not the scratching of pens and the shuffling of legal documents. But instead, you turned this table into a courtroom, and me into your judge. My voice rose as I spoke, filled with a bitterness I had held back for too long. Peter broke the silence first. Father, we just need clarity, that's all. We don't want to fight forever. His words sounded rehearsed, and they rang hollow. Charles let out a sharp laugh. Clarity? You mean you want him to say everything belongs to you? You've been circling like a hawk for years, Peter. Don't act noble now. I slammed my hand on the table, the sound so loud it startled even me. I said enough. Both of them froze, their mouths still open, as if the words they wanted to spit out had been stolen from them. I am tired of listening to excuses and accusations. I am tired of pretending I don't see the greed in your eyes. You think this is about fairness, but it isn't. It's about who can grab the most before I'm gone. And that, my sons, is what breaks me the most. Not the thought of dying, but the thought of leaving this world knowing I raised two men who measure love in dollars. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock in the hall ticked louder than ever, counting down the seconds of their silence. I saw them glance at each other, twin faces that once mirrored joy, now hardened by years of envy. They had no idea what was coming, and as I stood there, the weight of my decision pressed on me, but it also lit something new inside me, something like strength. They wanted me to choose a favorite, but I had made a choice of my own, one that would shake them both to their core. I stayed standing at the end of the table, letting the silence stretch long, enough to make them uncomfortable. Peter's fingers drummed nervously against his briefcase while Charles tapped the edge of his folder, his jaw set tight. They thought they had me cornered, forced to choose between them. But what they didn't realize was that I had been watching this fight build for years, and in that time I had crafted a decision that neither of them could have predicted. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. You came here tonight, demanding an answer, I said slowly, making sure each word carried the weight of my anger and disappointment. You wanted me to declare who is worth more in my eyes, who will inherit the larger share, who I trust the most. But I will tell you something neither of you seem to understand. Love is not something you weigh on a scale. It cannot be written into a contract or proven with receipts. And yet here you are, turning my life into a contest and this house into a courtroom. Do you know what that feels like for a father? Peter swallowed hard and tried to answer, but I cut him off with a sharp wave of my hand. Don't speak. Not yet. You've spoken enough over the years. Both of you have. You whispered poison into my ear when the other wasn't around, each of you trying to make me doubt the other. You thought I didn't notice, but I did. Every time you tried to sway me, it chipped away at what I once believed was unbreakable. You were born minutes apart, two halves of the same whole, and yet you've spent your lives competing as if the world could only hold one of you at a time. I turned away for a moment, my eyes falling on Margaret's chair again. Her presence lingered there, as if she were still seated with her gentle smile and calm voice, ready to remind us what Christmas truly meant. The ache in my chest grew heavier. Your mother begged me before she died, I said quietly, though my words carried across the room. She begged me to keep this family together, no matter what. I promised her I would. But I've failed. I've failed because tonight, on the day we should be honoring her memory, you have chosen greed over love. Charles leaned forward, his voice trembling as he tried to sound firm. Father, you're making it sound worse than it is. We just want clarity. We don't want to fight you. I snapped my head toward him. Don't you dare twist this into something noble. If it were only about clarity, you wouldn't have dragged lawyers into my home. You wouldn't have sat here on Christmas, tallying up sacrifices as if they were bills to be paid. This isn't about clarity. It's about control. It's about who gets more when I'm gone. You wanted me to choose a favorite. Fine. I'll give you an answer, but not the one you're expecting. Both of them straightened in their chairs, their lawyers sitting rigid, pens poised above their papers. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. Wanted them to feel every second, to realize the weight of what was coming. I have already written my will, I said at last, my voice calm and deliberate. It was finalized last month, and I did not tell either of you because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Tonight proves I was right. You thought I would sit here trembling, forced to hand my life's work to whichever of you shouted the loudest. But I am not afraid of either of you, and I am not afraid to tell you what I've decided. Peter's eyes narrowed. So, what is it then? Did you choose him? He gestured at Charles, his voice laced with bitterness. Charles fired back instantly. Or did you finally see through his act and give me what I deserve? I slammed my hand down on the table so hard the plates rattled. Stop. The word echoed against the walls, sharp enough to silence both of them. I let the quiet hang for a few seconds before I spoke again. Neither of you will get what you're expecting. Not one penny of my estate will go directly into your pockets. Not the house, not the savings, not the land. It is finished. I have given my life to raise you, and I will not spend my death rewarding greed. Their faces went pale, shock washing over them like cold water. For the first time all night, they were speechless. I took a deep breath, the words I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks now finally spilling into the open. My estate is placed in a trust. That trust will not serve you, but it will serve the future of this family, the grandchildren. Every dollar, every brick, every piece of land will belong to them when they come of age. Until then, it will be used for their education, their well-being, and their future. Not yours. You both have wasted too many years fighting. So I will not let you waste my legacy too. You wanted me to choose? Then I choose them. The ones who still have a chance to grow without the bitterness that has poisoned you. Charles shot to his feet, his face red, his voice shaking. "You can't do this. We're your sons. We've worked for you. We've sacrificed. And you've destroyed everything sacred about family in the process," I interrupted, my tone sharp but steady. "Do you think I care how many hours you logged fixing a furnace or how many bills you claim to have paid? None of that matters when the price has been my peace, my dignity, and my promise to your mother. You wanted a winner tonight, but the truth is, both of you lost the moment you let greed rule your hearts." Peter's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "So all of this was for nothing." I looked at him, and for a moment I saw the boy he once was, wide-eyed and innocent, tugging on my sleeve to show me a drawing he had made. That boy was long gone. "No, I leave this world, my grandchildren will inherit something better than money. They will inherit a lesson. They will learn that greed leads to nothing but loss." The room fell silent again. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do. Peter sank back into his chair, his face blank, while Charles stared at me with a mix of fury and disbelief. For once, neither of them had another argument ready. My decision had cut deeper than their words ever could. I reached for the carving knife, not to use it for drama, but simply to slice the turkey that had gone cold. "Dinner is served," I said quietly. "You can eat if you wish, or you can leave, but my decision will not change." Neither of them moved at first. The smell of the food hung in the air, heavy and uninviting. Eventually, Charles gathered his folder with shaking hands and stormed toward the door, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. Peter followed a moment later, his steps slower, his face pale as he clutched his briefcase. Neither looked back at me as they left, their lawyers trailing behind them in silence. When the door closed, the house was quiet again, too quiet. I sat down slowly, the weight of what had happened pressing on my shoulders. The candles had burned low, the turkey was untouched, and the table that once overflowed with laughter and warmth now sat in silence. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. I looked at Margaret's chair one last time and whispered, "I kept my promise in the only way I knew how." Then I poured myself a glass of wine, lifted it in her direction, and let the quiet settle around me like a blanket. The fight was over. They had wanted me to choose, and I had. They had expected to walk away with my fortune. Instead, they walked away with nothing but the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be worth more than any inheritance I could have given them. The house stayed silent long after the echo of the door shutting behind Peter and Charles faded into nothing. I sat alone at the table, the glow of the candles trembling against the walls, their flames dancing as if uncertain whether to live or die. The smell of roasted turkey filled the room, but it felt almost mocking now, a reminder of the Christmas dinner I had dreamed of but never received. I folded my hands in front of me and let the silence press down, heavy and suffocating, until it almost felt like Margaret herself was sitting across from me, watching everything unfold with sad, knowing eyes. For a long while I didn't move. My mind replayed the last hour in slow, painful pieces. Peter's cold eyes, Charles's clenched fists, their lawyers' pens scratching against the table. The way my sons had sat across from me, not as family, not even as men with respect for their father, but as rivals waiting for spoils. My decision had shocked them, yes, but it had also drained something out of me. My body felt older than it had, in years, and yet, in a strange way, lighter too. The burden of choosing, of carrying their anger in silence had been lifted. I thought of my grandchildren then. Little Thomas, who always ran up to me with sticky hands and a smile so wide it could melt the hardest heart. Sweet Anna, who loved to sit on my lap while I read her the same storybook again and again until she fell asleep against my shoulder. They had no idea about the fight between their father and uncle, no clue about the inheritance or the ugly words spoken tonight. Their world was still full of innocence, of playgrounds and crayons and bedtime stories. That was why I had made my choice. My estate, my legacy, would be protected for them. They would not inherit bitterness or rivalry. They would inherit the possibility of something better. Still, as I sat there in the dim light, my heart ached. It wasn't the money I grieved over. I had never cared much for wealth beyond what was needed to keep a roof over us. What hurt was the truth that had unfolded before me tonight. My sons no longer saw me as a father. To them, I was a vault holding land, money, a house, and things they believed they had earned the right to fight over. That was the deepest cut, sharper than any argument, deeper than any insult. I stood slowly, my knees stiff, and walked to the fireplace. Above the mantel was a photo in a worn wooden frame. It was taken 20 years ago, back when Margaret was alive and the boys were still teenagers. We had gone on a camping trip in the mountains. The photo showed the four of us, our arms around each other, smoke from the fire curling behind us, and smiles that looked as if nothing in the world could ever separate us. I reached out and touched the frame, tracing Margaret's face with my fingers. "I tried," I whispered into the silence. "I really tried." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, its low notes echoing through the empty house. Midnight. Christmas Day was ending, but it felt like something far greater had ended too. I went back to the dining table and poured myself another glass of wine. The liquid shimmered red in the candlelight, like the weight of bloodlines and history swirling in the glass. I raised it slowly, speaking aloud though no one was there to hear. "To you, Margaret, to the family we once were, and to the hope that maybe our grandchildren will be better than their fathers." The wine burned as it went down, but it steadied me. I sat back, staring at the cold food and scattered papers left behind. The lawyers hadn't even bothered to collect everything in their rush to leave. Contracts and arguments lay scattered across the tablecloth like the ashes of a battle. I gathered them into a pile and carried them to the fireplace. One by one, I fed them into the flames. The papers curled, blackened, and turned to smoke, rising up the chimney into the winter night. Watching them burn felt like cleansing, as though I was erasing the ugliness they had brought into my home. When the last page turned to ash, I stood there for a long time, staring into the flames until my eyes watered. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the flakes drifting past the window in soft spirals. I pressed my hand to the cold glass and remembered when the boys were small, begging to go outside to catch snowflakes on their tongues. Margaret would bundle them up in scarves and mittens, her laugh carrying through the yard as they ran in circles, their cheeks flushed with joy. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. That was the family I remembered. That was the family I had loved. I walked slowly upstairs to my study, where my safe sat tucked into the corner. I turned the dial with steady hands, pulling out the folder that held the finalized will and trust documents. I read through them one last time, making sure everything was exactly as I had planned. Every dollar, every asset, every property, locked into the trust for Thomas and Anna. My heart eased knowing it was already legally binding. Nothing Peter or Charles said or did could undo it. The grandchildren's future was secure, and the son's greed had been cut off at the root. As I set the papers back into the safe and locked it again, a thought crossed my mind. Maybe, just maybe, Peter and Charles would one day realize what they had lost. Maybe the shock of walking away empty-handed tonight would linger with them, forcing them to reflect. Maybe they would see that in their obsession with winning, they had both lost far more than money. They had lost me. The floor creaked under my feet as I returned downstairs, the house quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. No more arguments, no more whispers, no more careful silences, just peace. I sat again at the head of the table, staring at the flickering candles as the wax dripped down their sides. The turkey had gone completely cold by now, untouched, but I didn't mind. My appetite had left hours ago. What I felt instead was a strange kind of satisfaction. Christmas had been ruined, yes, but in its ruin, a decision had been born, final, unshakable. mine alone. For too long I had been afraid to confront the truth about my sons. Tonight, I faced it head-on. And in doing so, I had given myself something far greater than their approval. I had given myself freedom. I thought again of Margaret's last words to me, her frail hand gripping mine as her voice trembled. Promise me you'll take care of yourself. Promise me you won't let them turn you into something you're not. I had broken that promise once, letting their rivalry control me, weigh on me, steal years of peace. But not anymore. It without me. For the first time in years, I felt ready for whatever days I had left. My legacy was secure, my conscience clear, and my heart, though heavy, was free. As I extinguished the last candle, the room fell into darkness, and I whispered to the shadows, "It is finished." The morning after that long and bitter Christmas night, I woke earlier than usual, though I hadn't really slept. My body had rested in the bed, but my mind had carried on turning, going back again and again to the sight of my sons storming out of the house. The silence they left behind was deafening. For the first time in my life, I no longer saw them as my boys. Peter and Charles, who once raced down the hallway in their pajamas on Christmas morning, who once fought only over toy cars and whose arguments ended in laughter. No, what I saw in them now were men hardened by greed, men who looked at their father not with love, but with calculation. I dressed slowly, pulling on my sweater and walking down the stairs. The dining room looked exactly as it had when I left it the night before. Plates stacked with food sat cold, the turkey stiff, the candles long burned out. The table that had once been the center of our family, the place where birthdays and holidays had been celebrated with joy, now felt like the scene of a funeral, the funeral of trust, of family, of everything Margaret and I had tried to build. I gathered the plates, scraping the food into the bin, each scrape sounding louder than it should have. My chest tightened as I thought of the countless Christmas mornings when Margaret would bustle about in the kitchen, humming carols under her breath, the boys running in circles around her. She would have been devastated to see what our sons had become. I whispered to her memory, "I did what I could, Margaret. It was the only way." As I cleaned, I noticed a thin folder left on one of the chairs. Charles must have forgotten it in his anger. I opened it, and inside were pages of arguments, lists of supposed contributions he had made to my life, receipts, and letters. I read through them slowly, each line filled with a desperate attempt to prove worth through money and numbers. Helped with car repairs, 2009. Loan for property tax, 2016. The more I read, the more bitter I felt. Was this what family had been reduced to? A set of bullet points like items on a bill to be collected? I burned that folder too, feeding it into the fireplace, watching the smoke curl upward and vanish. By the time the last page crumbled into ash, my mind was clearer. Last night I had spoken with anger, but I realized now that beneath that anger was something sharper. Resolve. My choice was final. My sons would never receive what they had tried to claw from me. Everything I had would go to the grandchildren, untouched by their father's greed. The phone rang mid-morning. I let it ring twice before picking it up. I didn't need to check the caller ID to know it. Was one of them. It was Peter's voice, taut with strain. "Father," he began, but I cut him off before he could continue. "I don't want to hear excuses," I said firmly. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever again. What I said last night was final. It is already written, and nothing either of you say will change it." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then Peter's tone grew harsh. "You're making a mistake. You're letting years of sacrifice go unrecognized. I was there when Charles wasn't. I carried more weight than he ever did." I tightened my grip on the phone. "And yet you both arrived at my house with lawyers, demanding I measure love in percentages. Do you understand how shameful that is? You want me to pat you on the back for doing what any son should do for his father. That's not sacrifice, Peter. That's life. And if you believe it deserves payment, then you never understood family in the first place." He started to argue, but I hung up. My heart was pounding, but I felt strangely calm. Years of listening, years of silence, years of trying to keep the peace, they had ended last night, and I would not step backward now. By afternoon, Charles called. His voice was softer than Peter's, almost pleading. "Father, I lost my temper. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did, but you have to understand. I've given so much. I can't stand the idea of being overlooked." I closed my eyes. "Charles, do you hear yourself? Do you know what your mother would say if she were alive? She would cry to hear her son measure love in what he gave rather than what he felt. Do you know how many nights she stayed up sewing clothes, working overtime, and never once asked me for recognition? That is sacrifice. What you and Peter have done is not sacrifice. It is bargaining." He grew quiet. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, but instead his voice hardened. "If that's your decision, then don't expect us to stay around. Don't expect us to keep visiting." I let out a long breath. "Then so be it. I'd rather spend my final years in peace than in the company of sons who only see me as a wallet. I raised you better. The shame is yours, not mine." And I hung up. The rest of the day passed slowly. I walked the garden Margaret had planted, her roses now wilted from the cold, the wind carrying traces of snow across the yard. I thought of the years ahead, perhaps spent in silence, perhaps without the company of my sons. It was a painful thought, but it didn't frighten me. Because last night had taught me that true family isn't proven in words or visits or receipts. It's proven in loyalty, in kindness, in love without expectation of payment. When evening fell, I sat. It was cold. How Charles had defended Peter from bullies in the schoolyard, how they had once been inseparable. I wanted Thomas and Anna to know that their fathers had once been boys, filled with love, not just men filled with greed. Maybe, years from now, those letters would help them understand. As I finished the last letter, I felt a calmness I hadn't felt in years. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer the silence of loss. It was the silence of resolve, of freedom. For the first time in a long time, I knew who I was. Not a judge, not a vault, not a man to be fought over, but a father who had finally found the courage to say no. I closed the notebook, placed it gently on the mantel beside Margaret's picture, and whispered, "They wanted me to choose, and I did." The days that followed were strange. The house, which had always carried the echo of family during the holidays, now felt hollow. For years I had dreaded silence, filling it with background radio or the television humming, just to feel less alone. But after Christmas night, the silence didn't feel like an enemy anymore. It felt like a shield against the endless arguments, the manipulations, and the way Peter and Charles had turned every visit into a competition. Still, even with the quiet, I wasn't free of them. On the third day after Christmas, a letter arrived in the mail. I recognized Peter's handwriting before I even opened it. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to unfold the pages. The words were not written with the warmth of a son, but with the coldness of a man still trying to win a battle. He accused Charles of lying, of twisting events, of manipulating me. He wrote paragraph after paragraph listing all the ways he believed he had been the better son, the more deserving heir. At the end, he begged me to reconsider, promising that if I gave him the majority of the estate, he would ensure the family name was carried with pride. I set the letter aside without replying. There was nothing left to say. The very next day, another envelope came, this time from Charles. His tone was different, softer, but beneath his words I heard the same desperation. He wrote of his sacrifices, his loyalty, his endless efforts to be by my side. He spoke of Peter as selfish, greedy, and undeserving. "I know I'm not perfect, Father," the letter said, "but I've always loved you more than he has." I read it through once, folded it, and placed it next to Peter's. 2 letters written by grown men who still behaved like children fighting over scraps. That night, I burned them both in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the paper until nothing was left. The lawyer insisted I had been pressured into changing my will. Charles' lawyer claimed there was confusion surrounding my decision and suggested I clarify matters before misunderstandings worsened. Their voices were smooth, practiced, but I heard the same greed echoing through them. My own sons had sent these men to hound me, still unwilling to accept what I had already made clear. I didn't argue. I simply told each of them that the will was final, filed, and untouchable. If Peter and Charles wanted to waste their money paying lawyers to chase shadows, that was their choice. But I would not spend another breath justifying myself. Later that evening, as the snow piled against the window panes, I found myself sitting in Margaret's old chair, her quilt draped across the back. I closed my eyes and thought about her laugh, the way her hand used to rest gently on mine when she wanted to calm me. I imagined what she would have said if she'd been alive to see her sons bring lawyers into our home on Christmas Day. I could almost hear her voice. "Howard, stop carrying their weight. Let them carry their own mistakes for once." The next morning brought something unexpected, a knock at the door. My heart jolted, thinking it might be Peter or Charles, ready to argue face to face. But when I opened the door, I saw little Thomas standing there, his cheeks pink from the cold, his mittened hand clutching his mother's. Anna stood beside her, holding a small tin of cookies. Their mother, my daughter-in-law from Charles's side, smiled softly. "I hope we're not intruding," she said gently. The children wanted to see their grandfather. I stepped aside, and for the first time in days, the house filled with warmth again. Thomas ran straight to the living room, pointing at the tree that still stood decorated, though its lights had grown dim. Anna climbed into my lap without hesitation, her small arms wrapping around my neck. I felt tears sting my eyes as I held her close. For all the bitterness between their fathers, the children still carried the innocence of what family should mean. Their mother handed me the tin. "I don't know what happened on Christmas night," she admitted quietly, "but I just wanted you to know. Whatever it was, the children love you. They shouldn't lose their grandfather because of their father's choices." Her words struck me harder than anything Peter or Charles had said. It reminded me that, though my sons had chosen greed, the family line hadn't ended with them. There was still hope in the next generation. Hope in the way Thomas giggled as he crawled under the table, in the way Anna's small hand rested in mine as she told me about her new doll. For the rest of that day, the house was alive again. We drank hot cocoa in the kitchen, the children's laughter echoing against the walls, filling the empty spaces that had been left by anger. As I tucked them into the spare room for a nap, I thought to myself, this is why I made my choice. This is who deserves the inheritance. Not the sons who see me as a vault, but the grandchildren who see me as a grandfather. That night, after they left, the house was quiet again, but the silence felt different. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was peaceful, reassuring. I knew I had done the right thing. My sons could fight all they wanted, but the future belonged to the children. As I sat by the fireplace, the embers glowing faintly, I whispered to the darkness, "They'll understand one day, and if they don't, then so be it. At least the children will." The weeks after Christmas passed slowly. each day carrying with it a quiet rhythm I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, the phone didn't ring constantly with one son or the other trying to sway me. At first, the silence felt almost unnatural, like the calm before another storm, but gradually I learned to enjoy it. I woke early, made my coffee, and watched the winter light creep through the bay window. The air in the house seemed lighter, almost as if the walls themselves had breathed out after holding tension for so long. Still, I knew Peter and Charles well enough to expect they wouldn't let go easily. That became clear one bitter January afternoon when a thick envelope arrived in the mail, the kind with a law firm's name printed across the corner. I sat at the kitchen table, tearing it open slowly, already knowing what it would say. Inside were pages of legal jargon, a letter explaining that Peter intended to challenge my will on the grounds of mental competence. My own son was claiming I wasn't of sound mind when I finalized the documents. I felt my chest tighten, but not from fear, from anger. After everything I had done for him, after the years I had worked double shifts to pay for his education, after the roof I built with my own hands to keep him warm, this was what he thought of me. That I was confused, incapable, weak. The very next day, another envelope came, this one from Charles's lawyer. He, too, was threatening to challenge the will, though on different grounds. His letter accused Peter of undue influence over me, claiming that I had been pressured by his brother into changing my decision. The irony made me laugh bitterly. Each son believed I had been tricked by the other. Neither wanted to believe that I had made the choice myself. I carried both envelopes to the fireplace that evening. As the flames consumed them, I said out loud, "I am not confused. I am not weak. And I will not be bullied into changing what is already written." The crackle of the fire felt like an answer, a reminder that the documents in my safe were strong enough to withstand whatever noise my sons tried to make. But I would be lying if I said their actions didn't hurt me. I sat in Margaret's chair, staring into the flames, and wondered how two boys grow into men so blinded by greed. I thought of the years when they were young, when they would climb into my lap at night and beg for just one more story. I thought of how they used to race to see who could hug their mother first when she walked in the door after a long shift. Back then, they had been full of love. Where had it gone? The answer was simple, though painful. It had gone the moment they began to see life as a competition instead of a gift. They measured worth not by kindness or loyalty, but by how much they could claim. And no matter how I looked at it, I realized there was nothing left I could do to change them. It was a Sunday when the peace of my house was broken again, not by letters but by Peter himself. I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway and the slam of a car door. When I opened the front door, there he stood, his face tight with determination, a stack of papers in his hand. He didn't even greet me. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked into the living room like he owned it, dropping the papers on the coffee table. "Father, I don't want this to get ugly," he began, his voice sharp. "But Charles is already preparing to drag you into court, and I can't let him win. You need to understand. You don't have to go through this. Just amend the will, give me what I deserve, and I'll make sure everything is taken care of." I stared at him, my own son standing in front of me, with a demand dressed as kindness. "What you deserve?" I asked quietly. "And what exactly do you think that is, Peter?" His jaw tightened. "The house, the savings. You know I've done more for you than Charles ever has. I've earned it." The anger in me rose, but I kept my voice calm. "Peter, you think you've earned it? You think helping your father with a few bills means you are owed his entire life's work? I built this house with my hands. I paid for it with sweat and sacrifice. You've earned nothing but my disappointment." He flinched, his eyes narrowing. "So you're really going through with this? You're giving everything away to children who don't even understand what it means?" I stepped closer to him, my voice firm. "Yes, because those children have what you've lost. Innocence, kindness, love without conditions. They see me as their grandfather, not as a prize to be fought over, and I'd rather give everything I own to them than to sons who treat me like a vault to be cracked open." For a long moment, Peter just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. I could see the battle in his face, the desire to argue, to shout, to demand. But in the end, he grabbed the papers off the table, shoved them back into his briefcase, and stormed toward the door. Before he left, he turned to me, his voice low and filled with venom. "You'll regret this, Father. You'll regret turning your back on me." I watched him leave without another word. Sound of his car pulling out of the driveway echoed through the quiet night. But it didn't rattle me. His threat carried no weight anymore. My decision was final, and nothing he said or did could undo it. When the house was quiet again, I sat back in Margaret's chair and closed my eyes. My sons could threaten. They could argue. They could drag lawyers into my life. But they could not take away the peace I had finally found. The will was written. The future was secure. And in that certainty, I finally felt free. The weeks turned into months, and the storm I had feared from my sons never came. Peter stopped calling altogether, his pride too wounded to face me again after our last conversation. Charles sent one final letter filled with angry words, but when I didn't respond, he too went quiet. For the first time in years, my home was no longer a battlefield. It was just a home again, filled with peace, filled with the memories of Margaret's laughter and the echoes of the boys when they were still children. I spent more time with my grandchildren, Thomas and Anna, watching them play in the yard where their father and uncle had once chased each other with wooden swords. Their laughter carried through the air, free of rivalry, untouched by greed. It reminded me that the future wasn't lost, not yet. I had made sure of that. My legacy was not measured in money or land, but in what kind of people they would grow up to be. That was my final gift, and it was far more valuable than anything Peter or Charles had demanded. One spring evening, as the sun set over the garden Margaret had planted, I sat on the porch with Thomas on one side and Anna on the other. They leaned against me, their small hands wrapped around mine. For the first time in many years, I felt whole again. My sons may have chosen their path, but I had chosen mine. And in the end, I had no regrets. They had wanted me to choose a favorite, but what they didn't understand was that I had chosen something far greater. I had chosen peace, justice, and the promise of a better tomorrow. That was my final decision, and it left them speechless. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching.